You see the light gray rectangle here that those construction guys are filling in? That is the spot on the tarmac at Luton Airport in London that literally melted and had to be repaired yesterday because of how hot it was. Today was actually even hotter. This is footage of what the mayor of London called a huge surge in fires today as the UK had its hottest day ever recorded. And this was the view out of the window of a passenger train traveling northwest from Madrid, Spain yesterday. You can see the fire caused by Europe's intense heat wave is on both sides of the tracks as the train passed through. Much of Western Europe has been literally scorched for a week now with record-breaking temperatures. And tens of thousands have been forced to evacuate their homes. And terrifyingly, this is part of a larger global extreme heat phenomena, baking essentially the entire globe in a way that might no longer be correct to describe as a wave. It's more like the new normal for summers. And perhaps the most devastating part is the impact it is having on our health, on human health. The UK Meteorological Office, for the first time ever, issued what is known as a red alert for exceptional heat this week. And that means even otherwise, healthy people could be susceptible to illness and death from this heat. In Spain and Portugal alone, health officials have linked more than 1,700 deaths to the overwhelming heat, which makes it all the more notable that in a country like France, which suffered the same heat wave, 0 heat wave deaths have been reported. After suffering thousands of deaths back in 2003, France has gotten really serious and proactive about combating heat. Parks stay open 24/7 and have misting fountains set up to help cool down the public. The government proactively checks in on the elderly and the vulnerable. They have public air conditioning or cooling rooms and an app that shows you where you can find one. Free access to swimming pools, which are open every day until 10 p.m. Now, obviously, none of those solutions alone are a silver bullet to our climate crisis. And cities in the U.S. do a lot of those things here on their own. But clearly, being proactive and using the power of the government helps to save lives, which is why this is so infuriating. During President Biden's first week in office, he signed an executive order directing the establishment of an Office of Climate Change and Health Equity, basically an office within Health and Human Services to look at how climate change impacts human health and to suggest ideas for mitigating that impact daily. And the whole office was slated to only cost the federal government a grand total of, wait for it, $3 million to run, which compared to the federal government's overall spending is basically like a normal person spending a penny, quite honestly. And yet a year and a half after Biden's executive order, Congress still till this day, despite everything that is happening, has not funded that office at all. They have 0 funding and 0 permanent staff. And today we got some conflicting reports about whether or not Biden may declare a national emergency on climate change. Maybe Biden will do that. Maybe he won't. But here in the U.S. today, more than 68 million people live in areas where there were dangerous levels of heat. So with the climate crisis here and Congress refusing to act, what should President Biden do? Joining us now is Leah Stokes, professor of political science and environmental science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an advisor to the climate activist groups Evergreen Action and Rewiring America. She's also the host of the climate podcast, A Matter of Degrees. Leah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'll start with looking ahead to tomorrow. President Biden is reportedly going to announce some sort of executive action on climate change. We don't necessarily know what that will look like. If you were in his shoes, if you could advise him, what would you announce? What should he be doing?
Well, look, when we say that Congress won't act, that's not exactly true. It's Senator Manchin. It's one Democrat, as well as, of course, 50 other senators from the Republican Party who are refusing to act on climate change. That's really what we are talking about. We have hundreds of representatives from the Democratic Party in the House willing to act and 49 senators from the Democratic Party in the Senate willing to act. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. And President Biden needs to use the full force of his executive authority. And there's one thing that I think he really should do, which is that he should block a permit for a pipeline that runs through West Virginia that Senator Manchin really wants to be approved. And if he won't do the right thing for the planet and for his own grandchildren, then he should not get that permit for that pipeline.
No, fair enough, and that's a very good way to look at it. I mean, you bring up Senator Joe Manchin. He has yet again sunk Democratic efforts to pass meaningful climate legislation in Congress. This is maybe, I think, the fourth or fifth time now that he has sort of pulled a Lucy from Charlie Brown and pulled the football back just before Democrats could kick it. Can you help us understand why prolonging this negotiation is a problem in and of itself?
Absolutely. Senator Manchin has not been negotiating in good faith. He keeps saying that he wants to do something on climate change, yet it never materializes. And what Senator Schumer did, the majority leader, is that he gave him last week every single thing that Senator Manchin wanted, and yet Manchin still walked away. So finally, Senator Schumer called his bluff, and he said, "You're not serious about doing this on climate change." And that's why President Biden has been so delayed in terms of moving forward on the executive action that we desperately need him to be doing on climate change. We do have a president who cares a lot about this issue, and I think we're going to see him acting in the coming days and weeks.
You ended an op-ed in the New York Times this week by saying the climate crisis is getting worse and Congress is one vote short of saving us. We're going to have to save ourselves. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by we have to save ourselves?
Well, I think it's two things. First of all, in our daily lives, we should all be looking at the things that we own that run on fossil fuels, our cars, our stoves, our furnaces, and asking ourselves, how can we get off fossil fuels? Can we get an electric vehicle or an electric bike? Can we get an induction stove or a heat pump? There are things that each of us can be doing to try to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And that makes a lot of sense because it's also a lot cheaper when you're not dealing with all the inflation that's happening around fossil fuels. The second thing is we also need to be working as a community to keep ourselves cool. There's actually 100 million Americans today who are under extreme heat, and there are 60 million Americans who are under an extreme drought, the worst in a millennium. So all of us need to be pushing our politicians at the state level, at the local level, and still keeping on when it comes to President Biden and Congress that, you know what, we must act on climate change.